Friends, we've come together today to remember and to honor a life well lived. This is a space where you can be honest about our grief, share our memories, and find strength in one another's presence. We gather with hearts that are heavy, but also full of gratitude for the time we shared, for the impact one's life can have, and for the deep connection that binds us all. In this time together, we acknowledge the mystery and the frailty of life. We reflect not on what lies beyond, but on what remains with us, the love, the stories, the legacy. We come to offer comfort, to support each other in our loss, and to celebrate a life that mattered. Today, we remember Stephen with deep affections. We speak his name, share his story, and carry forward the values and the joy he brought into the world. In doing so, we affirm that a life leaves its mark, not in grand gestures alone, but in everyday kindness, courage, and care. Let us turn our hearts in prayer. In this moment of sorrow, may we find space for quiet reflection and honest feelings. May we listen deeply to the stories we tell, the memories we share, and the wisdom that life offers. In the face of loss, may patience guide us, and may the love we've known give us strength. Let the goodness in Stephen's life remind us of what truly matters: compassion, courage, laughter, and connection. And as we remember, may we be inspired to carry those same gifts forward in our own lives. May peace be with us, and may love be our lasting guide. Amen. At this time, we will have words of remembrance.
Thank you all for being here. You know, as I sat at my dad's bedside earlier this summer, I spent a lot of time with my stepmom, Polly, my sister, Anna, looking back at old photos, sharing memories and stories. You know, we read through a travel journal my dad had kept from a trip to Europe. He'd written something each day describing the sights, the people, recounting the travel headaches, also importantly, noting down all the good deals he'd found. $8 for lunch by the Eiffel Tower, in his words, a bargain at Paris prices. We revisited a lot of happy memories as we sat together during those days. A lot of great experiences that he and Polly had worked really hard to provide. As I've been wrapping my head around all of this, though, it's not those big moments that stand out so much as the small moments, the day-to-day of his life. One thing that's really resonated with me is one of those sort of mundane daily rituals that kind of fade into the background, but it stands out. Growing up, before each meal, we'd hold hands briefly and go around the table and say something we were thankful for. A big, small, graduation, a holiday, time together. Sometimes it felt meaningful, sometimes not, but as I've thought about how to talk about my dad, that daily practice has resonated. You know, I think the importance that he placed on it says a lot about him and who he was. By any objective measure, my dad had a life filled with impressive accomplishments. The second of 6 children, he was born in Providence, Rhode Island, grew up in Bayside, Queens, in a house that I'm sure was filled with chaotic activity. My dad's siblings describe him as being a steady presence, someone they could rely on for a kind word, the shoulder to lean on. My grandmother apparently said he never gave her any trouble. That's setting aside, of course, the short-lived attempt to run away from home that he made with my Uncle John. Despite meticulous planning, which in his later years he was a very thorough vacation planner, he hadn't quite got the knack of it at that age. They didn't make it out of the neighborhood. But from that childhood in Bayside, he went on to rack up a string of really sterling academic accomplishments: an undergraduate degree at Brown, a PhD in psychology at Princeton, an appointment at WashU where he taught and conducted research. It was after leaving WashU, though, that I think my dad ultimately found his true calling. He got a second graduate degree at UMSL, this time in clinical psychology, and then went on to a decades-long career at the VA, where he ultimately rose to Associate Chief of Staff and Chief of Mental Health Services. I'd really recommend to all of you the lovely summary reflections that his colleague, Dr. Fred Metzger, wrote. You'll find it with the programs by each door. It's a really touching tribute, and I think it gives an impressive account of all of his accomplishments there. Among many others, those included tripling the mental health staff and opening the Hope Recovery Center, which provides a wide range of services to homeless veterans. What really struck me about Dr. Metzger's words were not just the concrete accomplishments, though, but the spirit of his work. It was a career of public service dedicated to helping those who had given so much of themselves to their communities and to their country. And even as he rose through the leadership ranks at the hospital, my dad always cared most deeply and always talked about getting the most fulfillment from his individual interactions with patients. I didn't see my dad on the job, but those qualities are the ones that I recognized from his daily life. More than anything, my dad prioritized our family. He and Polly loved each other deeply. Over nearly 32 years of marriage, they built a life, a family, a beautiful home together, a century home in Webster that they spent years renovating. My dad always had a project around the house, sometimes more than I would have liked, as I spent Saturday after Saturday tearing down drywall or digging fence posts, but it was his passion. When he eventually retired, he and Polly traveled, taking a series of bucket list trips around the world, places like Vietnam, India, the Greek Isles, New Zealand, Peru, a sailing tour of the Caribbean. Looking at those pictures from those trips, I can see real joy in his eyes. Satisfaction after a long career and a lifetime of very careful savings. As I grew older, moved away, became busy with school, work, a family of my own, he and I talked less frequently, but I think more deeply. He was always eager to hear what I was working on, to share an insightful take on current events, to make sure that I was taking care of myself. He was thrilled when I found my own partner in life, and he was overjoyed to become a grandfather as my wife Paige and I started our own family, and then my sister Anna and her husband Paul did the same. It's a really cruel twist of fate that season of his life, which was filled with so much joy, was cut short. And it's crueler still that his Lewy body dementia so limited those last years of his life. One of the first things that he lost to his illness was the ability to find his words. Excuse me. For someone so sharp, so thoughtful, to be unable to express himself, I think was a source of real pain and frustration. But even through that, I never saw him lash out, and even when the words escaped him, his spirit was still there. these last few years have been really hard. They were hard for him, they were hard for me and for Anna and our families. They were really hard for Paulie, who was constantly by his side. Through all of that cruelty of his disease, the worry, the unfairness, it's felt difficult sometimes to be thankful recently. But as I've thought about what to say about my dad's life, gratitude is what I keep coming back to. He placed a lot of stock in pausing each day, however briefly, to acknowledge the things that we had to be thankful for. So as I reflect on my dad and what he's meant to me, I'd like to share some of the things that I'm thankful for. Grateful to have grown up in a loving home, in a neighborhood where my dad and Paulie took pride in their house and forged close, lasting friendships with neighbors. I'm grateful to have had a father who taught me the value of integrity and hard work, that good enough isn't good enough if you're capable of doing better. I'm grateful that in the dark days of his disease, he was supported and comforted by family and friends, both those here and those of us who lived far away. And I'm grateful that as Paige and I raise our own children, I now have a deeper understanding of some of the things that gave his life purpose, what it meant to him to be a husband and a father. Even as he's now gone from us physically, my dad is still a constant presence in my life. When I hear his words coming out of my mouth as I remind my kids that they have to share the Duplos, when I make up a story or a song at bedtime, sometimes more successfully than others, and when I watch with wonder as our kids discover the world. That world feels a little smaller, a little dimmer today in his absence. But as I think back on my life, it's clear to me that I am the person, that I am the father that I am today because of him. And for that, I'm grateful. Thank you.
Most of you don't know me, but I'm Len Green, and I'm the first, I'm the first person in St. Louis to meet Steve. I'm on faculty at WashU in psychology, and a professor at Stony Brook, where I did my graduate work, called me to say, you have an opening, you have to hire this guy, Steve Gaioni. I didn't know Steve at all, but Xenia Coulter was a fellow graduate student with Steve at Princeton, where there was an amazing group of brilliant people at the time. And Xenia said, you have to hire him, and so we fortunately brought him out to give a job talk. And I think I was the first person, if you don't count the people at the airport, I'm the first person he actually met, because we were going out for dinner the night before his job talk, and so he came over to my house, and a friend from the UK was there with her dog, and I introduced them. And then another colleague was joining us to go out for dinner, and so I answered the door, opened it, and he and his wife were there, and they freaked out because of this dog. There was this tiny little ugly dog, but I don't know, they just freaked out, and I mean, it was a disaster. And then we still had to go out for dinner and spend the evening with this crazy colleague of mine. And I use that term clinically and professionally, certifiably crazy. And I thought, well, there's no way in hell, that we're going to be able to recruit him after this, because this is another colleague. But typical Steve, he didn't let that be an example of whether or not he should join the department. He sort of ignored this crazy person and didn't use them as representative of the rest of us, fortunately. So we did hire him, much to my excitement. And Xenia Coulter was ecstatic also, and she's in New York now, upstate New York. And I just spoke to her the other night, and she sends her love and regrets, of course. So I may be the person who, in fact, here in St. Louis knows Steve the longest since that first night. And I sort of feel silly trying to say wonderful things about Steve because you all know Steve, so you don't need me to tell you the goodness in him. And I love the term good when we talk about Steve. We know his even-temperedness, his calmness, and his goodness. In these times, when one could argue with seemingly fewer good people, people who are nasty, vengeful, self-absorbed, how wonderful it is to have a few moments for us to be reminded of our friendship with Steve and reflect on how our lives have been enriched because we're the beneficiaries of that friendship. Give you some examples of his goodness. Well, first, sort of his quality. I remember we were talking one day, and I was sort of apologizing. Oh, now I'm going to make enemies here. I was sort of apologizing for St. Louis. It's a small town. There's not that many things going on. I'm a provincial New Yorker, so you may not forgive me, but, and the Yanks won last night. And Steve, in his usual magnanimous way, just talked about how the richness of St. Louis, how wonderful St. Louis was. And I found that a sobering thought, saying, yes, why I can't compare to another place. We have to look at the goodness, the quality of where we are and what it has to offer. There was one time where I was very ill. So I was in ICU and things looked pretty bad. And so my brother from New York flew out, and it was Steve who went to the airport to pick him up, to bring him to the hospital, which is a wonderful thing to do. But what was special, and this was before Steve became a clinician, but showed his clinical acumen, he prepared my brother for coming to the hospital and what he was going to see, which wasn't very pleasant. There was a time with my wife Anna, before she was my wife Anna, I was in DC and she was going to fly out to see me in DC, but there was going to be a TWA strike the next day, and they called Anna to say, there's the last flight out before the strike. If you want it, you have to get here right away. And Anna didn't drive, and this was pre-Uber and Lyft. She called Steve and said, I need to get to the airport. And Steve, of course, said, sure, and drove to the house, picked her up immediately, and drove her to the airport. Just all these incredible examples of just the calmness of the individual, the goodness of the individual. But I thought, Mark gave you a sense, and the statement by the other clinician at the VA of the quality of this man. I also, because I'm a colleague of his in psychology, that I want to get across his scientific contributions, because many of you wouldn't be aware of that. When he was at Princeton, he was part of a top group of graduate students, postdocs, faculty, And Steve was described, unsurprisingly, as quiet, humble, and easy to talk with. He had mentioned how about becoming a psych major. What he said was he planned to be a math major, but when he took his first real serious math course in college, he realized that that wasn't for him, that he couldn't do, quote, real math, and so he switched from math to psych. I still don't know why psych, but that was his argument for leaving math. And as a graduate student, he was one who was always asking penetrating questions. Why the research we do matters, what's important about the research. And you have to understand at the time, Steve was a rat researcher, so rat was one of his major organisms of interest. And he would keep asking the question of, why should we waste our time studying rats if we're interested in human behavior? A question I'm also a rat researcher, or was a rat researcher at the time. And in fact, there was a speaker who came to Princeton, and Steve was taking him to dinner, and he asked the speaker the question, why should anyone care about rat research? We have an administration now who doesn't ask the question, they just don't fund it. But then they don't fund anything of value. And he even posed that question to the speaker, who answered sort of glibly, well, it keeps us off the streets. Not so sure that's a great answer, but it was a clever one. When he was at WashU in the psych department, I was serving as associate editor of this journal, and Steve was telling me about the study he had done, which I thought was really exciting and interesting, and it had to do with testing out an important implication of one of the most important major mathematical models of learning in psychology. And Steve did this terrific study, and so I solicited a manuscript from him that, of course, was published in this journal. His research at WashU in psychology mostly focused on ducks and ducklings' distress calls. And I would argue his work on distress calls and ducklings, with its really important implications for human growth and development and how one should raise children, let alone ducklings, is seminal work. He also, when his major work focused on learning in mathematical models, which I found sort of ironic, given he didn't think he was much of a mathematician, and yet here's all this work on mathematical learning theory that was just groundbreaking. When he left psychology and went into biology and neuroscience, he then did work with bats on computational models of auditory perception in bats. Again, I find it interesting, he's doing computational modeling, which is high-powered mathematical work, not simple little stuff. And then after he left WashU, he became a leading clinician at the VA, as Mark has already pointed out. And what I found important is he continued collaborative research that showed his interest in making life better for others. For example, an article he published while he was at the VA was on treatment outcomes in outpatient asthma center. So he continued his interest in serving other people, both as a clinician and as a researcher. There was just pure goodness in Steve, with his deep concern for the welfare of others. And the image I have of him most seared in my brain, and I feel confident in predicting that those of us who know him will concur, is his smile. And that smile is an image that will not fade from any of us. So thank you.
Reading from Psalms 139. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me up and behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall come over me, and night wraps itself around me, even then the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed me, my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven into the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. I tried to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. Words of remembrance.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anna. I am blessed to be Steve's daughter. I am not being pretentious. I made several edits to what I was going to say today, and I ran out of time, so I wrote it last night. I had, the last couple of weeks have been rough. But I struggled with figuring out what I would say about my dad, because all of us were so blessed to be touched in some way by this wonderful man. We all know that he was very intelligent. He was very kind and all that, but they also didn't get to see my dad because, he wasn't their dad. But he was very privileged to get to be my dad and a dad to my brother as well. But the best way I can think to honor him is to talk about the things that he did for the people he loved, to remember him, and to carry on his legacy as long as we're alive. I've been quite blessed to have the gift of a very, very good, vivid memory. So those memories are the things I'll talk about today. I remember many drives with my dad, time in the car, rides, most of the time until I got my license, but he took me to daycare. My mom worked long hours at the state hospital, so she was very dedicated to her patients, and the hours were less than ideal for a working mom. But he was there. He got me up in the morning, and I remember going to daycare, and I had gotten so good at the drive. I was a professional backseat driver from the young age of 1 or 2. I would throw tantrums if he took the incorrect route. Now, I grew up in Webster Groves, and for those of you who aren't familiar, Shrewsbury is the town over. It's a 5-minute drive. And there are multiple ways to get there. But if he took the wrong one, I would have a full-on tantrum. I don't know what I was thinking, but it was wrong. He also drove me many days until my mom was able to retire and stay at home with me full-time. That he would drive me to my elementary school, which is the Forsyth School, and that's actually right down the road from here. There were times when we'd be rushing out the door. He some days would drop me off and the school would be closed. And I know there was a day where my heart was broken, and I was just sitting alone with my pink backpack in 2nd grade on the steps of the school, alone, crying, waiting for him to come back. But he was very dedicated to his patients and the staff that he cared so much about. And it wasn't until he got to work, I think he was working at John Cochran that day, but not sure because I didn't know how to tell time yet. But he came right back when somebody told him, "Hey, Steve, your daughter doesn't have school today." So he came back, thank goodness, and I got to hang out. Maybe it was actually at Jefferson Barracks, but I got to hang out with Pam, his lovely administrative assistant, and that was fun. I wanted to hang out with my dad, but you know, the HIPAA, we know what that is now. He also, there were days, he was almost religious about his routine. He liked to brew his coffee. Eventually we bought him his own bean roaster, whole beans, because he loved it so much. We had a coffee-themed birthday for him one year, and he took a liking to roasting his own raw beans from all these places, many in Central and South America, and it smelled so good. I loved the smell of coffee being roasted. I wasn't a huge fan of the taste. I still don't really drink coffee. My husband makes fun of me because my coffee is half a cup of black coffee and poured over hot chocolate powder, and then you add at least half a cup of coconut milk and give it a stir, maybe add some caramel if you would like, but there's very little coffee in it. It's just really to wake me up. But he drank his coffee, and because we were running late to school in typical Gaioni fashion, he just plopped me in the car, got in the back seat, left his mug on top of his car. And from Webster to here, you take one road, and that is Big Bend. There's only one way to get there. Just kidding, there's actually two. But he took Big Bend, and the road had not been resurfaced for many years. It was riddled with potholes. And he didn't know where his coffee was. You know, what a travesty, Dad. We were running late. And we pulled up to school, and I was always the first one to be dropped off and the last one to be picked up at this age. But I liked it. I mean, I got to know the staff members very well at school. But we found his coffee mug on top of the car and made it with most of the coffee still inside. Now, I don't think it was hot anymore, but you know, my dad, he didn't care. It was there. He'd probably drink it, and he wasn't against reheating it in the microwave at work. I also remember the time he picked me up from this very church after a mission trip to Biloxi, Mississippi, in 7th grade, and he rolled up in this new car, and I'm like, is that my dad? It was his brand new 2010 Honda Accord, still in commission today thanks to our lovely neighbor Chris. My dad had never bought a brand new car. This was his very first brand new car, and he was proud of it. I got in, I checked it out, it smelled good. I asked him, why'd you buy it? He's like, well, I did my research, and it's reliable, and it can accommodate both short and very tall drivers, meaning my brother and I would be able to drive it in the future. And then I remember the countless road trips to New York City to visit my grandma and grandpa. We started out by, when I was really young, we'd break it up into 2 legs. Now it's all day driving. But as I got older and more familiar with being in the car for a very long time, I was thankful I was short because I could lay across the back seat, just fully extended. But we would, as a family, get up at what I would call the butt crack of dawn, way before the sun had come up. I was tired. My routine was to just get myself into the car, pack the night before. And my mom and dad, before I could drive, would take turns, driving. He would start, my mom would do a leg, and then his goal, because it's a long drive, it's usually about 16 hours nonstop, his goal was to get to my grandparents' house by midnight Eastern time, so it gave us 1 less hour to try to get there. Because if we timed it just right, we could avoid the traffic on the George Washington Bridge. Now, we didn't always make it in time, but my grandparents were always there, ready to greet us no matter what time we arrived. And then there were the days where I was learning how to drive. I had been inspired by my dad's selection of vehicles over the years, and I wanted to learn how to drive stick. So my first vehicle was a Volkswagen Jetta that he bought in cash, and he spent several days in the heat of the summer, in August, so today, with me in the car at Hickson Middle School, with me stalling every few feet. And if anyone's ever driven stick, it just kills the engine. The car turns off, the AC stops working. But I was determined to learn, and he had this incredible amount of patience to teach me. Now, you may not be much of a car person, but cars are how I learned how to recognize people. And it might be in part because my dad seemed to run through cars like burner phones. He never cared about what he drove, as long as it drove, and that he could buy it outright, meaning that it was probably cheap. And I believe that his cheapest car was one that he bought for $1. And he bought it off a professor that he had in grad school after the guy's wife had ran it into a tree. And they were moving to Australia the next day. But he was willing to buy it and put the work into it, and it drove. He has so many stories about the cars that he drove. He was able to recall every single vehicle he had ever owned and remember something distinct about them, like the car that he got from Kate and Ed, I think after they were moving to Missouri and didn't need the car. And it's how I know people. I needed to know mostly because I never knew who was picking me up. I mean, it could have been a random stranger for all I knew, but if I knew my dad's car, I knew I was okay. But again, he went through a lot of them, so I had to get to know a lot of cars. My dad was a big reader. One of his favorite things to do was just read a book. I mean, who does that anymore? He also would try to share that love of reading with me growing up. He used to be able to get away with Hop on Pop and Where the Wild Things Are and do all the voices. But pretty soon I started asking for more original material. And he was an amazing storyteller. I think it came from his half-Irish side, because my grandmother was also a very good storyteller. He was also very good at explaining things to me in a way that I would understand. It wasn't ever condescending. He truly wanted me to be able to understand and to learn. But the kinds of bedtime stories I got as a kid were mostly about people. I was curious. I wanted to know about our family, about him, about how I came to be part of this family, because goodness gracious, I look nothing like them. But also my favorite story was about how he met my mom. I asked him to tell it over and over and over again, because he was able to incite so much feeling in just the facts. He told me they met at a restaurant, and he was pretty tired of going out for sushi because their lead researcher was Japanese, and he needed a break from the sushi. And so he went out to eat alone at a restaurant, and he was familiarized with eating alone. You know, he had so much time and whatnot, but he stood behind a beautiful woman who also happened to be dining alone. And they got to talking. There weren't any tables available, so they hit it off right away. They talked, they laughed. And my mom, actually, her table was ready first. And so she invited him to have a meal with her. And so that was the start of their beautiful story. But with anything, you know, to satisfy my innate curiosity as a young child, he explained things, he told them, he was funny, but he didn't romanticize things, make it a fairy tale, or sugarcoat it. He was factual, honest, and incredibly genuine. And I really appreciated that as a kid, because it felt like I was having a real grown-up conversation with somebody. You could tell from his stories or his explanations about how he felt about the things or the people that he was talking about. His love for my mom came through very vividly, and I remember how much he would light up whenever he talked about his days as a research psychologist before pivoting to clinical psychology. He served as a freshman advisor here at WashU, and this was probably before I went to college, because that's when I started having those college talks with him. You know, where are you going to go to college? And you know, I was a legacy at Brown and Princeton, but they kind of filled their Asian quota a little bit early. So I narrowed my search down to somewhere closer to home. I could never really gain enough courage to leave the state of Missouri. I was very close to my dad, and I loved my mom. I don't know what I would do without her, but these talks often involved advice or guidance. It wasn't unsolicited. I cared about what he had to say, but he was very passionate, and he told me, you know, in any crossroads that I had, he was very reassuring, and he actually told me why he chose psychology after believing he was meant to be a math professor. He said the math got too hard because it was a linear algebra class, and he for the first time felt like it was something he just couldn't wrap his head around. It was a little too analytical and confusing. I've taken linear algebra. It doesn't make sense to most people. I get it. But he was at a crossroads himself at Brown, and he wasn't sure what he was going to do. His whole life, he was so good at math, and he really thought that was the path he was supposed to take. But he spoke with his advisor, and his advisor said, you know what? take a course, anything outside of your field. Maybe try something in the behavioral sciences, psychology. And that first general psychology course is what ignited his passion for psychology. My dad had a unique sense of humor, much like his own father, who was also funny. He used to study and teach animal behavior here at WashU. For one of the classes that he was teaching, he decided to do an icebreaker with his students. He designed an experiment. The theory was, if humans had homing ability like squirrels do, they would be able to locate the direction of their point of origin no matter how far away they were. He tested this by loading all the students up into a van, blindfolded, and drove them out to some remote spot in St. Charles County. Asked them to get out, take off their blindfolds, and point to campus. Now, many of these students aren't from St. Louis. They have no idea where St. Charles is, how far they had probably been driven. And they just kind of pointed in every which direction, had no concept of anything. The landmarks weren't familiar. His conclusion was that humans did not, in fact, possess any homing ability. So there's that. But some of my favorite stories that he told me were about my Uncle Robert. You see, Rob passed away when I was very young. I think I was 4. Of all the memories that I do have, I actually don't remember him. I know what he looked like from pictures, stuff like that, but I don't remember speaking with him, sitting on his lap for wheelchair rides. I might have been a little scared, but my dad was able to bring him back to life through the stories that he told me. He quickly became one of the most inspirational people I knew, or let alone didn't really know, but felt like I knew. For those of you who didn't get a chance to know him, he was the 4th child in the family lineup of 6. And he had something called muscular dystrophy. You could tell just how much my dad loved his brother. He spoke very highly of him and everything he accomplished while he was alive. I mean, he faced so much adversity because this was prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act. They didn't have those reasonable accommodations. And he told me that their mom, my grandma, made sure that he was never treated any differently growing up. He still had to finish his homework at the dining room table before he was allowed to play, just like all the other siblings, no exceptions, even if his hand was tired. But when I think about my own children and how I will navigate my dad's death with them someday, because I have a 2-year-old named Jaden and a 4-month-old Ezra, who didn't really get the time that I know my dad would have wanted with them. I truly hope that all these memories that I have about him will somehow be able to bring him back to life so that they too can know how incredible their grandpa was. But I want to end with a quote attributed to Dr. Seuss. "Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happens." And as you can see, I'm not wearing what one might consider the traditional colors of mourning, and that's because I want to ask each of you that when you think of my dad, try to smile. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss him. I sure do. But I don't think my dad would want you to be sad for too long. I think he'd want you to be able to remember a time that you shared with him that brought you joy or laughter, and to bring a smile to your face. And even though I'm not related to him genetically, I felt like I was his family because we have the same smile. I learned it from him over all these years, and it really made me feel like I was his daughter. I wasn't just adopted, and just because I didn't share genes with him didn't change anything. He made me feel loved and special, and so very blessed. So, thank you.
Please join me in the reading of the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is anger, where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as understand, to be loved as loved. For it is given We've come to the close of our service. The family invites everyone to go down the hall to a reception area.